Our scripture today is from the book of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Today is the Sunday that we celebrate Epiphany. So I think maybe we should go into what is Epiphany and why do we celebrate it? Well, the word itself, the literal meaning, means to manifest, to show forth, or to clarify. In the Greco-Roman world, when this was written, it was used to describe the public appearance of state officials when they would go out to the provinces. In the early church, it was a designation for the manifestation of God in the presence of Christ. You know, we've had a lot of history and changes in the things we celebrate. In the early church, the main holidays were Easter, Pentecost, and Epiphany. And Epiphany kind of encompassed the birth of Jesus, the visit of the Magi, and the baptism of the Lord by John the Baptist, kind of all rolled into one celebration. And we separated out Christmas for the birth, and we separated out baptism of the Lord Sunday, and now Epiphany is really associated with the visit of the Magi. And in some places it's still celebrated, in some places in the world, it's still celebrated pretty widely. They celebrate it with blessing of water. They eat special foods like king's cake. And in some areas, that's really the bigger gift-giving occasion, is Epiphany. When you sing the old song about the 12 days of Christmas, Epiphany is that 12th day. Between Christmas and Epiphany are 12 days, and the old time they used to celebrate the whole time, but now we kind of separate out those 2 days. So at Epiphany, we celebrate that God, we don't just celebrate that God was made human, but that the manifestation was revealed, was seen and revealed to men, and celebrated. Luke tells of shepherds and Matthew tells of wise men. In fact, even though Matthew is one of the synoptic gospels with Mark and Luke, and they're meant to be seen together, read together, and they share a lot of stories, the story of the Magi, or wise men, as we call it, is one of a few that is only told in Matthew. So let's look a little more closely at these men and why Matthew thought it was important to tell us about them. Matthew calls them wise men. That's been interpreted as magi. They were probably astronomers and astrologers. Those things kind of went together back then. People studied the stars, and they believed that the stars influenced their lives. They were well educated. We know they were wealthy. We know that by the fact that they were able to make this journey and the quality of the gifts that they bring. It says they had treasure chests. And what we don't know is exactly how many of them there were. The Western Church says 3, based on the fact that there were 3 gifts. The Eastern Church celebrates 12 magi. And even in the Western Church, we've given them names, traditional names. Those aren't really based on fact. We aren't given names or numbers exactly. We're just told that they came. There may well have been more than 12. We don't know. Traveling was safer at that time in large groups, especially when you had valuable cargo. We just don't know. But we do know that they came. We know that they weren't there for the birth. So the nativity scene with the kings is not really accurate. 12 days isn't really right either. But we just kind of fixed the 12 days to acknowledge that time had passed. It was probably closer to 2 years that they were journeying to see Christ, judging by the age of the children that Herod had killed when he was trying to kill Christ. We know that they were men. We're told that. And plus, I've heard it said that if they had been wise women, they would have brought blankets, diapers, and casseroles instead of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But truthfully, to look at that, why weren't there women? Well, the culture of the time, women were less likely to be educated. They weren't allowed to travel as freely. But I would bet that by the time those wise men got there, there'd already been women from the neighborhood there to help the new mom with the baby, and they probably brought those blankets at that time. We do know that the wise men found Mary and the child in a house. So they were still in Bethlehem, even though 2 years had passed, or approximately. Why did they stay there? Well, probably Mary wasn't really eager to travel right after having a baby. Joseph had family connections there. Maybe it was easier to stay there and try to build a new little life together. We don't know for sure. We just know they were there. And we know that the Magi brought gifts to Jesus. Brought gold, which symbolized his status as a king. Frankincense, which was burned as an offering to the gods, and it symbolized his status as a high priest and as God. And myrrh, which was a burial spice, and it predicted his death. So this is what we know. This is all that we really know. So we have to ask the question, why does it matter? How can studying these men help us today? What do they have to say to us? Well, we've got to look even a little bit closer for that. We know these men undertook a long and dangerous journey. They left everything they were familiar with. They gave up comfort. Travel in those days was difficult. It was uncomfortable. And they did all that because they had seen a sign from God. So they went looking for what God wanted them to do. They wanted to see what God had in store for them. So they followed that sign. They weren't Jews. We know that. They were outsiders. They were people on the margins of Jewish society, like the shepherds, like Mary and Joseph, who were a poor couple. They weren't the people you would have expected to get the message from God. And that kind of reassures us that Jesus was sent for all people, even in the very beginning. These non-Jews traveled 2 years to see him because they'd seen his sign. So, but since they weren't Jews, they went to Jerusalem to ask. That was the center of Jewish life. It was where Jewish power was centered. It was where the Jewish religion was centered, and they probably thought it was a good place to seek this new king, that the people of Jerusalem would be excited about it, that they would be able to point them in the right direction. And of course, that's what they found, wasn't it? Everybody was excited. No, that's not what they found. They found people to be unaware. They hadn't been paying attention to the signs. They thought they knew what was going to happen, so they weren't really looking for signs. So they went asking, and Herod became aware of them and their questions. And he sent for them secretly. He didn't want anyone to know that he was giving any credence to what they said. But he finds out what they've seen, what they're looking for, and he's afraid. He's afraid because he wants to preserve his own power. He doesn't want any other king. So he consults with religious leaders, and they tell him where he could find the child. And it doesn't say they're with him in the plot to destroy the child, but it really doesn't say they tried to talk him out of it either. Looks like maybe they were more interested in saving their own lives and status and keeping Herod happy than what might happen to this child. But the wise men go and find Jesus, and they worship this poor young child. I mean, these were important men in their own culture. They were wealthy. They were educated. And it says they knelt down and worshiped, paid homage. They humbled themselves in front of this baby. The new king, the new God, wasn't where they expected him to be. So they went where he really was and accepted things as they found them and worshiped this poor young child. They were willing to put their own importance aside and worship. And after they've paid homage and presented their gifts, they're planning to go back to Jerusalem and tell Herod what they found. They didn't dream really at that time that a political leader would misrepresent his faith and lie to them so that he could preserve his power. I'm glad that doesn't ever happen today, right? But God warns them in a dream to go home by another road. Now, how many times have we made plans only to find out that fulfilling them does not mesh with God's plan for our lives? There's an old expression, men make plans and God laughs. But sometimes it's hard to let go with the plans we have, and we argue with God. Sometimes we just ignore what we're being told because we want what we want. But the wise men immediately changed their plans and obeyed God. That's hard to do. Herod and the religious leaders weren't willing to change their circumstances. They were interested in saving what they already had. That's easy to do. And the more we have, the harder it is to give it up or change our plans. Sometimes we as individuals Sometimes we as a church have a hard time with that. And it gets worse the closer we are to political power and to politics in general. It's hard to give up wealth, power, status. But the wise men remind us that we need to humble ourselves. We need to worship God where He is, not where we expect Him to be. We need to give up our pride and our possessions when we're called on to do so. We need to be open to God's leading. We need to change our plans when God asks. We need to be willing to go home by another road. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.